May 25th, 1962, Stage 14 at 20th Century Fox Studios. Marilyn Monroe was supposed to arrive at 6 in the morning for makeup. She arrived at 2:30 in the afternoon, 8.5 hours late, and when she finally emerged from her trailer, the crew could see she was already gone. Not physically absent, though she would be that too over the next 32 days of shooting, but gone in a way that was more terrifying, more final. Her eyes were glassy, unfocused, staring at something no one else could see. Her hands trembled as she tried to hold her script. Her famous walk had become an unsteady shuffle, and when director George Cukor called action, Marilyn Monroe opened her mouth to deliver her first line, and nothing came out except a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. This wasn't just an actress having a bad day. This was Hollywood's biggest star publicly disintegrating in front of 100 crew members, $23 million in production costs, and a studio system that had finally run out of patience. What happened over the next 4 weeks on the set of Something's Got to Give wasn't just the death of a movie. It was the death of Marilyn Monroe's career, captured in real time, documented by call sheets and production reports. And the most devastating part was that Marilyn knew exactly what was happening. She knew she was dying. She just couldn't stop. If you're fascinated by the untold stories of Hollywood's golden age and want to discover what really happened behind the glamour, subscribe to our channel. We reveal the truths they tried to bury. To understand what happened on the set of Something's Got to Give, you need to understand where Marilyn Monroe was in May 1962. At 36 years old, she hadn't completed a film in over a year. Her last movie, The Misfits, had been both a critical success and a personal disaster. Her marriage to playwright Arthur Miller had disintegrated during filming. Her co-star, Clark Gable, had died of a heart attack just days after production concluded, and Hollywood whispered that the stress of working with an increasingly unreliable Marilyn had killed him. The studios were losing patience. Marilyn's reputation for lateness, for forgetting lines, for requiring dozens of takes, had gone from quirky diva behavior to genuine liability. Insurance companies were refusing to cover productions that featured her. Directors who had once begged to work with her were now declining offers. The woman who had been Hollywood's most bankable star was becoming unemployable. Something's Got to Give was supposed to change all that. It was a romantic comedy remake of My Favorite Wife, light and frothy, perfect Marilyn Monroe material. The studio paired her with Dean Martin, one of Hollywood's most reliable leading men. They hired George Cukor, a legendary director known for his work with actresses. Everything was in place for Marilyn's triumphant return. 20th Century Fox was betting $23 million that she could pull it off. But from the very first day, everyone involved knew they were in trouble. The problems started before filming even began. Marilyn was supposed to attend costume fittings in early April. She missed the first fitting, then the second, then the third. When she finally showed up on April 10th, she arrived 3 hours late, and costume designer Jean-Louis could see immediately that something was wrong. Marilyn's weight had fluctuated dramatically. The costumes no longer fit. More concerning was her demeanor. She seemed disoriented, confused, unable to focus on simple questions. The studio executives held an emergency meeting. They discussed replacing Marilyn before production even started, but the math didn't work. They had already spent millions in pre-production. Dean Martin's contract stated he was signing on to work with Marilyn Monroe specifically, and if she was replaced, he could walk away. Without both Monroe and Martin, there was no movie. The first scheduled day of principal photography was April 23, 1962. Marilyn didn't show up. She called in sick with what her doctor described as a severe sinus infection. The production was shut down for the day, costing the studio approximately $150,000. This was before a single frame of film had been shot. April 24th. Marilyn didn't show up. Same excuse. Another $150,000 lost. April 25th. Still sick. The studio sent their own doctor to examine her, but Marilyn refused to let him into her Brentwood home. By this point, George Cukor was shooting around her, filming scenes with other actors, trying to salvage something from the expensive sets. But everyone knew they couldn't continue much longer without their star. On May 25, 1962, after missing the first 22 scheduled shooting days, Marilyn Monroe finally arrived on the set of Something's Got to Give. What the crew saw when she emerged from her trailer that afternoon made them wish she had stayed home. Paula Strasberg, Marilyn's drama coach and closest confidant during this period, later described what happened in Marilyn's trailer that first morning on set. Marilyn had arrived at 2:30 p.m. for a 6 a.m. call time, but arriving was just the beginning of the problem. She had to be transformed from whoever she was that day into Marilyn Monroe, the performance, the product, the icon that audiences expected to see. The makeup process that used to take 90 minutes now took over 3 hours. Makeup artist Alan Snyder, who had been working with Marilyn since 1948, said her hands shook so badly that he had to hold her head still to apply eyeliner. Hairstylist Agnes Flanagan found that Marilyn's famous platinum blonde hair was breaking off in patches from years of chemical processing. They had to use extensions to hide the damage, but the most disturbing part happened when Marilyn was finally ready to leave the trailer. Paula Strasberg would have Marilyn look at herself in the full-length mirror. This was supposed to be a final check. Instead, Marilyn would stare at her reflection for long minutes, sometimes crying, sometimes whispering to herself, sometimes just standing there with complete confusion on her face. "She doesn't recognize herself anymore," Paula confided to a friend after that first day. "She looks in the mirror and she's trying to find Norma Jean, but all she sees is Marilyn Monroe, and she doesn't know who that person is anymore." When Marilyn finally walked onto stage 14, production assistants radioed ahead to warn everyone she was coming. The set went silent with tense anticipation. Marilyn Monroe walked in looking like a ghost. The hair was perfect. The makeup was flawless. But something fundamental was missing. The life behind the eyes, the confidence in the walk, the spark that had made her Marilyn Monroe. George Cukor called for quiet on set. The camera rolled. He called action for the first take of Marilyn Monroe's final film. Marilyn opened her mouth to deliver her first line, a simple piece of comedy dialogue. Nothing came out. She stood there, staring at the camera, her mouth moving but no sound emerging. 20 seconds passed. 30. At 45 seconds, Marilyn began to cry. Not pretty tears, hard, ugly sobs that shook her whole body and smeared the makeup that had taken 3 hours to apply. This scene would repeat, with variations, over the next 32 days, creating a documentary record of a woman's complete psychological collapse in front of 100 witnesses who couldn't or wouldn't stop filming. Over the next weeks, a devastating pattern established itself. Marilyn would be called for a 6 a.m. makeup start. She would arrive anywhere from 3 to 8 hours late. The makeup and hair process would stretch to 3 or 4 hours because Marilyn couldn't sit still, couldn't focus, would suddenly leave the trailer for long periods without explanation. By the time she was ready to film, it would be mid-afternoon, and the crew would have been waiting since early morning. And then, when she finally arrived on set, the real nightmare would begin. Simple scenes that should have required 2 or 3 takes were taking 40, 50, sometimes over 60 takes. Not because Marilyn was a perfectionist, but because she genuinely could not remember her lines, could not remember where she was supposed to stand, could not remember what scene they were shooting. Between takes, she would return to her trailer, and crew members walking past would hear her inside, crying and saying things that made them uncomfortable. Things like, "I can't do this anymore." Things like, "Marilyn is dying." Things like, "Why won't someone help me?" On May 29th, 1962, several crew members glanced through Marilyn's trailer window during a lunch break and saw something that haunted them for decades. Marilyn was sitting at her makeup table, surrounded by pill bottles. Not just a couple of prescriptions, dozens of bottles, covering the entire surface. She was picking them up one by one, reading labels, opening them, counting out pills into her palm. She looked like someone trying to solve a math problem, trying to figure out the right combination that would make her feel normal, would let her be Marilyn Monroe one more time. One production assistant, a young woman who had idolized Marilyn, stood outside that trailer and watched through the window for almost 10 minutes. Later, she would tell a friend that she knew she was watching someone die. Not in that moment, not from those specific pills, but dying in a larger sense. Dying from the inside out. Dying from being Marilyn Monroe for so long that Norma Jean Baker had suffocated somewhere deep inside. She wanted to knock on the door to ask if Marilyn needed help, but crew members had been explicitly instructed not to disturb Miss Monroe in her trailer unless summoned. So she stood there, watching, and did nothing. She would spend the rest of her life wondering if knocking on that door might have changed what happened 6 weeks later. On June 1st, 1962, Something's Got to Give filmed what would become its most famous scene. The script called for Marilyn's character to skinny dip in a swimming pool, and after negotiation, Marilyn agreed to film the scene partially nude, the first time a major Hollywood star had done so in a mainstream studio production. The resulting photographs of Marilyn swimming in a turquoise pool would be published in magazines around the world and create the illusion that everything was fine. But the people on set that day tell a very different story. Photographer Lawrence Schiller said getting those famous shots required over 4 hours of shooting, with Marilyn going in and out of the pool dozens of times. Between takes, she would return to her trailer, and the crew could hear her crying. The water was heated, but Marilyn kept complaining she was cold, shivering in the warm California sun. Several times she had to be helped out of the pool because she seemed disoriented, unsure of where she was. George Cukor kept the cameras rolling because he knew this might be the only usable footage they would get from the entire production. The swimming pool scene could be edited to look playful and sexy, even if the reality was a woman barely holding herself together. The famous photograph of Marilyn in the pool, smiling with that knowing, sexy look, was actually take number 47. In takes 1 through 46, she couldn't hold the smile, couldn't find that famous Monroe sparkle. Lawrence Schiller described her expression as pleading, like she was begging us to stop, to let her rest, to let her go home. But on take 47, for just a few seconds, she found it. The camera captured it, and that was the image that went out to the world. That night, Marilyn called Paula Strasberg at 3 a.m. Paula later recounted the conversation. Marilyn was incoherent, clearly under the influence of sleeping pills, and kept repeating the same phrase. Norma Jean died today. She drowned in that pool. Norma Jean is dead, and Marilyn is all that's left, and Marilyn is dying too. Paula immediately called Dr. Ralph Greenson, Marilyn's psychiatrist, to report the call and express her concern. Dr. Greenson assured Paula he would handle it. 6 weeks later, Marilyn Monroe would be found dead, with Dr. Greenson being one of the last people to see her alive. By early June 1962, 20th Century Fox was facing a financial crisis. Their biblical epic Cleopatra, starring Elizabeth Taylor, was massively over budget, eventually costing over $40 million. Something's Got to Give had already burned through most of its $23 million budget without producing enough usable footage, and Marilyn Monroe was now a liability they could no longer afford. The executives reviewed the production reports. Out of 32 scheduled shooting days, Marilyn had been present and able to work on only 12. Even on those 12 days, simple scenes that should have taken an hour were taking 6 or 7 hours. The footage they did get was marginal, with Marilyn's performance so uneven that editors were struggling to piece together anything coherent. The financial calculations were brutal but clear. If they continued with Marilyn, the production would cost close to $30 million, and the final product would likely be unmarketable. The alternative was to fire Marilyn Monroe, replace her with another actress, and reshoot everything. The math suggested replacement would ultimately be cheaper than continuing with a star who couldn't function. More importantly, it would send a message to Hollywood. Not even Marilyn Monroe, the biggest star in the world, was bigger than the studio system. On June 7, 1962, the board of directors at 20th Century Fox made their decision. Marilyn Monroe would be fired from Something's Got to Give, effective immediately. She would also be sued for breach of contract. The studio would hire Lee Remick to replace her and begin reshooting the following week. And Marilyn Monroe, after 16 years as a Hollywood star, would be effectively blacklisted. On June 8, 1962, at 11 a.m., a telegram was delivered to Marilyn Monroe's home in Brentwood. It contained 3 words that ended a career. "You are fired." What Marilyn Monroe did in the 6 weeks between her firing on June 8 and her death on August 5, 1962, has been the subject of countless books and documentaries. The official story is that she tried to resurrect her career, negotiating with the studio for reinstatement. The reality, according to those who saw her, was far darker. Paula Strasberg visited Marilyn almost every day during June and July. She later told friends that Marilyn had given up, not just on her career, but on life itself. She spent most days in bed, curtains drawn even in the afternoon, the house dark and silent. The pill bottles that had been concerning on set had multiplied. Dr. Greenson was visiting multiple times per day, sometimes spending 4 or 5 hours at her house. The most heartbreaking detail from this period comes from Marilyn's housekeeper, Eunice Murray. She reported that Marilyn would wander through her house in the middle of the night, looking at photographs on the walls, photographs of Marilyn Monroe at premieres, on movie sets, receiving awards, and Marilyn would stand in front of these photographs and cry, saying, "I don't know who that person is. I don't know how to be her anymore." On July 11, 1962, Marilyn gave her final major interview to Life magazine. Reading it today, knowing what would happen 3 weeks later, is devastating. She talked about wanting to be taken seriously as an actress, about being typecast as a dumb blonde when she was actually intelligent, and she said something that reads like a warning. Everybody is always tugging at you. They would all like a sort of chunk out of you, but you do want to stay intact and on 2 feet. By late July, the industry gossip was that Marilyn Monroe was finished. The lawsuit from Fox was proceeding. No other studio would touch her. At 36 years old, after 16 years as Hollywood's biggest star, her career was over, and unlike other stars who had fallen from grace, she had no other life to return to. She had been Marilyn Monroe for so long that Norma Jean Baker no longer existed. On August 4, 1962, Marilyn spent her final day at home in Brentwood, making and receiving phone calls. Dr. Greenson visited in the afternoon, allegedly leaving around 7 p.m. with Marilyn in good spirits. Her housekeeper was staying overnight. At some point during the night or early morning of August 5th, Marilyn took a fatal dose of barbiturates. She was found dead in her bedroom around 3:30 a.m. She was 36 years old. In an ironic twist, Something's Got to Give became more valuable as an unfinished film than it ever would have been as a completed one. The raw footage shot during those 32 days has been studied and shown in documentaries more than most successful movies. Everyone wants to see the last footage of Marilyn Monroe. Everyone wants to look for clues about what was really happening. The footage is disturbing to watch if you know what you're looking for. In the outtakes, you can see Marilyn trying to hold herself together. You can see her forget her lines and start again. You can see her hands shaking as she reaches for a prop. You can see her looking off camera at Paula Strasberg, seeking reassurance, seeking something Paula couldn't give her. And most haunting, you can see the moments between takes, when Marilyn thought the camera had stopped, but the film was still going, capturing her face when she didn't think anyone was watching. In those moments, you can see exhaustion and despair, and something that looks like relief. George Cukor, who had worked with some of Hollywood's greatest actresses, including Katharine Hepburn and Greta Garbo, said watching the footage of Marilyn on Something's Got to Give was the most painful experience of his 50-year career. Not because she was bad, but because he could see what was happening and he couldn't stop it. "We were all complicit," he told a friend years later. "The studio, the crew, me, everyone. We saw that she was drowning, and instead of throwing her a rope, we kept filming. We kept demanding that she perform. And when she finally couldn't do it anymore, we fired her and replaced her and moved on as if she had never existed. That's what Hollywood does. It consumes people and then pretends it didn't." Something's Got to Give cost 20th Century Fox approximately $23 million in direct production costs, plus millions more in legal fees. The film was eventually completed and released in 1963 as Move Over, Darling, starring Doris Day and James Garner. It was a modest success. No one remembers it. It's a footnote in Hollywood history, notable only for being the film that replaced the Marilyn Monroe version. But the real cost can't be measured in dollars. It cost Marilyn Monroe her career and, arguably, her life. It cost George Cukor his peace of mind. It cost every crew member who watched the collapse their innocence about what the entertainment industry really was. And it cost Hollywood itself something precious. The illusion that the studio system cared about its stars as human beings rather than assets to be exploited until they broke. After Marilyn's death, the industry changed. Not quickly and not completely, but the absolute power that studios had held over contracted players began to erode. Actors started demanding more control, better working conditions, and the right to say no. The studio system that had dominated Hollywood for 4 decades began to crumble in the 1960s, and Marilyn Monroe's death was certainly one factor in that collapse. Because what happened on the set of Something's Got to Give was too visible, too public, too documented to be hidden. 100 crew members had watched it happen. Millions of people had read about Marilyn's struggles and then, 6 weeks later, read about her death. And the connection between the two events was too obvious to ignore. Hollywood had created Marilyn Monroe, exploited her for 16 years, and then discarded her when she became inconvenient. And the discard had killed her. The footage from Something's Got to Give remains in the Fox archives. Watching it today, knowing how the story ends, is almost unbearable. You're watching someone die in slow motion. You're seeing the exact moment when a human being realizes that the performance they've been giving for 16 years is no longer sustainable, that they can't remove the mask they've been wearing because it's fused to their face. And the most devastating part is that everyone involved knew it was happening. The crew knew, the director knew, the studio knew, and they kept filming anyway, kept demanding one more take, kept insisting that she perform, right up until the moment she couldn't anymore, and they fired her. On August 5th, 1962, the world mourned Marilyn Monroe, Hollywood icon, America's sweetheart, the most famous actress of her generation. But the people who had been on the set of Something's Got to Give, who had watched those 32 days of collapse, knew a different truth. Marilyn Monroe hadn't died on August 5th, 1962. She had died on June 8th, when that telegram arrived. Or maybe she had died on May 25th, when she couldn't remember her lines. Or maybe she had died in 1946, when Norma Jean Baker signed a contract that gave a studio the right to erase her and create someone else. What died on August 5th was just the body. The person, the real human being underneath the performance, had been dead for years. Something's Got to Give just documented the final stages of that death, capturing on film what happens when the performance becomes unsustainable, when the mask can't be maintained anymore, when there's nothing left to give. And that's why the footage from those 32 days remains so important, so disturbing. Because it's not just the last footage of Marilyn Monroe, it's a documentary record of what Hollywood really was in the studio system era. It's evidence of a crime that was legal, celebrated, and profitable. It's proof that the entertainment industry didn't just create stars, it consumed them, used them up, and discarded them when they couldn't perform anymore. Marilyn Monroe's career ended on June 8, 1962, with a three-word telegram. Her life ended on August 5, 1962, with a bottle of pills. But the real tragedy was that both endings were preventable. If someone had stepped in, if someone had said stop, if someone had valued Norma Jean Baker as much as they valued the profits that Marilyn Monroe generated. But no one did. They kept filming until there was nothing left to film. They kept demanding the performance until she couldn't give it anymore, and when she finally broke, they fired her and hired someone else. That's the real story of Something's Got to Give. Not a movie that didn't get made, but a system that destroyed the person it had created and then blamed her for being destroyed. The question that haunts everyone who studies this story is simple. Could Marilyn Monroe have been saved? We'll never know. What we do know is that nobody tried hard enough, and Marilyn Monroe, alone in her bedroom, surrounded by pill bottles and photographs of a woman she no longer recognized, made a decision or an accident or a mistake that ended her life at 36. The footage is the evidence. 32 days of film showing what happens when you force someone to be someone they're not for so long that they forget how to be anyone at all. Showing the cost of fame measured not in money, but in identity, sanity, and life itself. And every frame is proof of a crime that Hollywood committed and that we, as audiences who consumed the performance and demanded more, were complicit in. Marilyn Monroe died on August 5, 1962, but Something's Got to Give proves she was already dying months before, killed slowly by a system that valued the performance more than the person. That's what really happened in those 32 days. That's the truth everyone involved carried with them. And that's why Something's Got to Give remains one of the most important documents in Hollywood history. Not because of what it was supposed to be, but because of what it actually was. The documented death of the most famous actress in the world, witnessed by 100 people and ignored by a system that cared more about profits than people. 3 words ended Marilyn Monroe's career. 6 weeks later, she was dead. And everyone who watched those 32 days knew the connection wasn't coincidental. It was causal, it was inevitable, It was murder disguised as business as usual in Hollywood.